Well, thank you, Lena, and I want to thank Skip for inviting me. Skip spoke at an institution I was teaching at one time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I want to tell you, really upheld Arkansas quite well, and we're really proud to have you at Cambridge, Skip. I was thinking when I learned that Dale and Betty were coming, what I should say, other than the obvious, that you have a partnership that could not have represented a state better. But I want to tell you, Dale and Betty, I want to welcome you to Little Rock. And you might say, why would I say that? I lived here before the two of you. From the time of 2 weeks to 3 months, I was a citizen of Little Rock, Arkansas. My father was stationed at Camp Robinson, so welcome to Little Rock. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, Dale, I think, was the most respected United States Senator of a generation. And as everybody in Washington came to know, he was the second most able member of the family. But anyway, as most people have come to understand, politics has high and low moments, and sometimes it brings out the better angels of our nature, sometimes baser instincts, and higher moments often are characterized by expansions of political tolerance, lower moments by debilitating discourse. I sometimes suggest that the difference between George W. Bush and Barack Obama might be described as the fact that Bush was called a fascist, and Obama's been called a fascist and a communist, sometimes at the same time by the same people. And one may ask, what's wrong with a bit of hyperbole? And the answer is plenty, because some frameworks of thought are designed to express rival ideas, and some frameworks are designed to define enemies. And if we, for instance, lost 400,000 American soldiers, and I will tell you, at my father's time at Camp Robinson, he kept on his bedroom wall, to the time he died, a picture of himself with 6 fellow officers at this camp. And my dad died in his 80s, and the other 6 are buried in cemeteries strewn through Europe. And these were great Americans. And the reason I raise it at this time is simply that if you take any kind of organization, a basketball team, a legislature, a business, a country, there are always lots of examples of lesser people working together that make something greater, and examples of greater people not working together and making something lesser. And this is true of a country. I mean, we have a choice of pulling together or pulling apart. And we also have a choice of whether we want to emphasize the decent or something that's less so. I've been traveling the country talking about civility, as Elena mentioned. And I will tell you, the concept of public manners is one of the duller concepts that could be. No one wants to have someone shake a finger at them. But there are very few topics that are more important than civility, because they affect how individuals interrelate in community, and they affect how communities, or communities writ large, meaning a country, interrelates with other countries, and affects, in many ways, life on the planet. Words, for example, can reflect meaning, but they also can reflect emotion, and they can clarify or cloud thought. And it's how we say things and think things that have an effect. But civility itself is not principally about words or manners. And it doesn't in any circumstance imply that there isn't a case for a good argument. In fact, I would suspect if one were to take the last generation or two, now's the time for a pretty good argument because there's a sense that things aren't going well. And there is a sense that I think has some validity that the best and the brightest in America have, to some degree, let the country down. And so we're now in the process of trying to straighten out some things that haven't gone well. And so argumentation is appropriate. In fact, argumentation is always appropriate. It's a social good. And if you think the opposite, which is kind of a philosophical way of looking at almost any issue, if you don't have arguments, what do you have? And you have a system of dogmatism at one end, and in politics you might even have a system that's tyrannical. There never were many arguments in the Soviet Union. There aren't arguments today in North Korea. And so, at least public arguments. So you want to have a society based on arguments, but you also want to have a society in which the most important thing and the thing that I talk about the most is not necessarily the choice of words, but whether or not one listens to someone else, and best of all, whether or not someone puts himself in someone else's shoes. In a democracy, and it's more the case with each passing year because society gets more complicated, and there's very seldom only one proper path that's determinable by one individual, or in our kind of system, one political party. And of all the places in America that lend themselves least to certitude, it's public policy. Dale will tell you that if you take the crafting of a bill, it's not only Republican, Democrat, but it's a lot of different people, and that he might have an approach that is really excellent, and someone else might have an amendment that makes it less excellent, but the fact is the total package is likely to be a little bit better if it has a lot of people's participation. And that's the way you get acceptability. And in general, there is something that someone comes at almost any issue from the opposite perspective one of us or you or someone you know might take, but that person generally adds something to the debate and adds something that might be wise, might be something that should be taken into consideration, or at least adds something to the thought process that one can say this deals with better than that person might think. But it's always good to have a second or third or fourth or fifth dimension. And that's one of the reasons why humility is a valued character trait, and why civility is so important to our society. In the 19th century, the poet Walt Whitman described America as an athletic democracy. And by that, he wasn't talking about sports. He was talking about vigor and ruggedness and elbows hitting other people's. And as Elena mentioned, we actually had a public figure shooting and more than a few duels. In fact, several presidents were involved in duels, the most active of which was Andrew Jackson. So what we would describe as uncivil behavior is not new, and nor is it something that is worse today. What I think that Dale would agree with me is correct. The Congress has gotten less civil in the last 30 years, but we've had more uncivil periods in American history. And there are lots of commentary of why Congress has gotten less civil, and they relate to public issues, they relate to the public, they relate to the type of people elected, and they relate to some of the constraints on time that have caused people to stop becoming as family-oriented. In fact, when we read biographies of people in Congress in the first half of the 20th century and earlier, it seems that everyone was a good friend of Jack Daniels. And you have all these biographies of leaders meeting at 4 in the afternoon and kind of over with Jack deciding what the direction of the Congress would be. Today, Congress is not a body that has a lot of heavy lifting, but there seem to be accelerating time constraints, and people don't deal with other members to near the degree they once did, and they certainly don't socialize the way they once did. The family is not as central in politics. But I want to go into some courses I developed. When I left Congress and taught for a couple of years, I developed about 50 courses, what I call 2-minute courses in public governance. And I want to give you half a dozen of them as kind of a rationale for why America is changing its way at looking at politics. And the first course I call Political Science 101. And it's a very simple course, and it's mathematical. If you take the last generation, on the whole, with kind of changes, we're about a third Democratic as a country, about a third Republican, about a third no party. And so the math comes in, if half of a third is a sixth, that means a sixth of the American people control the Democratic Party and a sixth the Republican Party. And that means the candidates, and it means to some degree the direction, platforms, etc. But if you take primaries, and in legislative races in general, about 1 in 4 participate in big primaries, often 1 in 8, 1 in 12. But if you take a big primary, 1 in 4 participate, that means 1/4 times 1/6, or 1/24 control the Republican Party, 1/24 the Democratic Party. And if you then say, who is that 1/24, or if it's, could be 1/48, or it could be less than that, it's an interesting phenomenon. In my political party, when I was a young candidate, it was really kind of a Goldwater kind of attitude, a very flinty, conservative approach to numbers. Today it's evolved into much more of a social conservatism, and it's a pretty strong feeling group. If you take the Democratic Party, there's been much more consistency. It's kind of an old-fashioned liberalism. But what I'm getting at is people forget that there are 2 elements to getting to be a candidate. You have to prevail in the primary, and then you have to prevail in a general election. And increasingly, primaries are pretty hard charged today, legislatively. And in the House of Representatives, which is different than the Senate, but in 80 to 85% of the seats, there's total security of one party or the other. And what that means is that you have a candidate that only has to be concerned for the primary. And that makes that candidate pretty dedicated to the base vote. And the one aspect of politics that's changed from our founders' definition, although there are a lot of changes, but at least from their expectations, the founders talked about a country in which a legislative body would reflect the entire views of the country. And they were thinking because of the difference in states, because of the difference of the farmer versus the merchant versus someone that might be a little bit of a different kind of professional, but mainly farmer versus merchant. But today there's one hugely unrepresented group, particularly in the House of Representatives, but increasingly in the Senate, and that is the American middle. And it's a really extraordinary phenomenon that the center has been eroded from American politics based upon the primary process. And that brings me to my second course I call Political Science 102, and it is a course that everybody knows half of and nobody thinks much about the other half. And that is, if Dale's running for president as a Democrat, everybody knows he's got to be pretty liberal in the primary. But in the general election, he kind of scoots to the center. And if Betty, of all things, were to run as a Republican candidate, she would be pretty conservative in the primary and then try to scoot to the center and fight for the center. But in legislative politics, the first half is true in getting to be a candidate for the Senate or the House, but the second half doesn't exist. There's no scoot to the center. And the reason is that if one scoots to the center, that implies one, of all things, and it's worse than a four-letter word, compromises. And if there is a movement towards trying to take other people's views into perspective, there is a guarantee that that person will offend the base of the party, and a virtual assurance that there will be a primary challenge. And therefore, if one believes that people in elective life have put a lot of stock into re-election, there isn't a great deal of incentive to move to the center or compromise or not be precisely where one's base in a political party is. And this is putting a feeling into American politics that hasn't existed before, to the degree that it currently exists. And one of the reasons it hasn't existed before is I remember once hearing a political science professor in college, and I never took a course in American governance in my life, but I remember this one comment that a poll was done about throughout the American public and found that something like 80% of the people did not know where their congressman had ever voted on any issue. Now, the public had some sense that they had a Republican or a Democratic congressman. They might have a sense that one might be a little more liberal or a little more conservative, but often not. But today, with the trigger issues in American politics and with a base that can gravitate in a communications way as never before, the base becomes the centerpiece of those that are, quote, professional politicians, and it makes it very difficult. I have a course I call Journalism 101, which is that things have changed in the communications manner in ways that the public really is watching and has come to understand. But some of it has a base in prior history. That is, in the 19th century, virtually every city of any size, every town had at least two newspapers. And one would be Whig and one would be Democratic, and then there might be an ethnic one, there might be a religious one, and there might just be other newspapers. But as the 20th century hit, newspapers started to consolidate, and one had a bigger audience. And when there were just a Whig paper and a Democratic paper, the words were pretty tough, much tougher than today's newspapers, and somewhat vituperative. But as newspapers started to appeal to a bigger audience with consolidation, they tried to be a little bit more balanced, and then in the latter part of the 20th century in particular, there's hardly a newspaper in America on the editorial page that doesn't have one liberal op-ed writer and one conservative, because the newspaper is in a business of wanting to appeal to as broad a section as possible. But when we had radio, it first started out to be a hugely broad thing, and people were relatively balanced. We had some incidents, like in the 30s, a speaker named Father Coughlin, who was considered somewhat of a right-winger. And then when the first TV came on, and you had the quasi-monopoly of the three stations, there was a real competition for being the most balanced. And you had a generation of journalists like Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow and others that the public largely admired. Now, there was always a public that thought that the news media was a little too liberal or a little too conservative, but in general, there was a real understanding that people tried to be balanced. Then we've had two or three really important things happen. And one is that as we've developed more TV media, there's vastly more competition. And then with the new techniques of communicating with people that aren't, first of all, news, advertisers started to go to new places. And so the traditional media lost its financial footing. And then some in the TV media figured out that you could look at television as a commerce just the way you can a women's clothing store, that is a retail store. And just as there's a retail store that focuses on the tall and the big, and someone else that might focus on the thrifty and someone else on the elegant, news media start to tailor their news. And so now we have some news media that tailors news conservatively, some liberally, and some remains trying to strike a balance, but it appears that the winners are those that tailor. This is a very extraordinary phenomenon. And then with the sophistication of communications, there are two battles that are really taking place. And one is that everybody in this room has the capacity through the internet to tap into knowledge of a more sophisticated nature than everyone has had ready access before. And from a news perspective, for example, you can tap into blogs that are absolutely sensational, that have the latest news from Egypt, from the Palestinian territory, from China. And then you also have news that's of a blog nature that is quite one-sided. And so one of the great social cleavages in the country that is fast developing is between those who choose to look at things that are deeper and more balanced and those who choose to look at things that are simply of a single perspective dimension. And this applies to the United States as a country, and it applies to almost everybody in the world. And so the great unanswered question is whether all the new communications capacities are going to bring the world closer together, or whether they're going to ensure greater bifurcation. And these are things that we all have to think about. Whether we can affect is quite another matter. I have a course I call Philosophy 101, which is simply the absence of abstraction. When people went to college years ago, and in politics, people used to talk about the common good, the greatest good of the greatest number, which was an old thesis of a group of British utilitarians in the 19th century. It's all breaking down, and you hear rhetoric about having to appeal to a party's base. You have rhetoric about how do you balance interest groups. And so politics is tied into money, it's tied into philosophical divisions, but when you tie all these together, the sum total is not necessarily the public good or the national interest. For instance, if you take money in politics, it's self-evident poor people don't have any. If you take some of the deepest felt philosophical moorings that people have, that doesn't mean that they apply to everybody. And so you do have real kinds of splits that there are aspects of American history that reflect, but are getting reflected in new and different ways today. Another philosophy course I talk about is simply that there's something about the human condition that wants to have decision-making in a way that reflects their views and with their input. Tip O'Neill, the great Speaker of the House, used to comment that all politics is local. And yet we're in a world in which there is a great deal of globalism, and globalism is kind of on everybody's tip of their tongue. But there's a contrast between globalism and localism everywhere in the world, including the United States. And to understand what's happening, it appears that Tip was right about all politics is local, but it's also true now that all politics is affected by global events. So how we piece all these things together is crucial. I have a course I call Sports 101, and it's very simple. If we all knew of a sports writer that we can't visualize, that 2 or 3 generations ago, and this is a man named Grantland Rice, said that winning isn't the most important thing, it's how you play the game. Well, in politics, the temper and the integrity of the political debate is often more important than the outcome of most issues. I used to, when I entered the political realm, because I'd participated in a lot of sports in my life, I used to make these one-to-one analogies between sports and politics. You know, they're both very competitive. They both involve a lot of preparation. There's an outcome. When I left politics, it dawned on me that these analogies had broken down. And they'd broken down because sports has a much higher ethic. And I stress this, and I don't mean it as exactly a joke, because if you think about it, if you're playing a football game, there is a referee who'll drop a flag if one clips or is offside. If you take an academic community, no president of a university is going to hire a coach who says that he wants the kids to cheat or not respect the opponent. I'm reminded of I once heard a female athletic director give a speech talking about a tennis match and about a tennis point in which there were many volleys, a lot of backhands and forehands and net play and racing back to the back line. Finally, the point was won and the crowd stood up and applauded, and the two players dropped their rackets and applauded each other. Well, where do you see that in politics? In fact, I'm thinking a year ago, I represent the part of the state of Iowa, and we have two great state universities. One's called University of Iowa in the Big Ten, and Iowa State in the Big 12. And our Big 10 school, or our Big 12 school, frankly, hasn't done so well in football for maybe a century, but a year ago they played at Nebraska, and they were about an 18 touchdown underdog. And by chance, the football gods caused a series of fumbles, and they played and they were taken too lightly, and in the very end, they prevailed. And this caught their team awfully by surprise. But as they were coming out of into the dugout, into the tunnel to leave, the Nebraska people stood up and applauded. That's pretty nice. And where does it happen in sports? And so I like to suggest that we've got to raise the sport of adults to a higher ethic than the sport of kids. Let me just mention a couple more analogies. I like to talk about literature a lot. And one of my most memorable books, actually set of books that I read as a college student, I was highly inspired, not by a course, but I was trying to impress a young girl at a girls' school. And that, you know, there's no greater academic kind of incentive than that. And the fashionable set of books at my time in college was something called the Alexandria Quartet by a British author named Lawrence Durrell, and it was a set of 4 books that were set in between World War I and World War II in Alexandria, Egypt. And the subject matter was a very incidental series of events in this town, or this great city. And there were 4 books, each titled by the name of a participant in these events. And they were all 4 were first-person narratives. And they were all about the same set of events. And you wonder, why do you read anything 4 different times about the same event? And it ends up, and this was a literary moral of the books, that all 4 stories were totally different. And the moral was that you couldn't get a sense for reality unless you looked at something from more than one set of eyes. I mean, with each story, you learn vastly more than you learned in the first story. And so this has analogies in family discussions, in a courtroom. It has analogies in international relations, where sometimes what we might do looks very reasonable from our perspective, but a Middle Easterner or a European or Asian or African might look at it very differently. Which brings me to what I call Reality 101, which is what I think is the most important political observation of the last century, and it comes from a scientist. And this is something that basically governed much of the life of Betty Bumpers. Albert Einstein said that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And that's a really remarkable thought, the implication being that throughout history, people have known war. but never have people known the capacity to destroy the whole planet. So Betty formed a group called Peace Links. Not that peace isn't an issue in many generations and many time frames, but it's a very different issue when you can destroy all of mankind. The other implication of the Einstein quote, which I think is profound, is that if you take the world, you take America in particular, what hallmarks this is change and its acceleration, the rapidity of change. But the notion that human nature is the closest to a constant. I once, to a group of historians, made the reference of human nature being our only constant, and several came up to me afterwards and said, no, that's not the case. I mean, that people do think differently in different times and from different environments in different ways. And so now I say it's a relative constant. But if you think, for example, the notion of the 7 deadly sins, which go back centuries, possibly millennium, no one knows their origin. But there are aspects of human nature that seem to be a constant, one of which is pride. I often make a distinction between sometimes in business circles that you see greed overcoming circumstance, but greed is far more rational than pride. And in politics, the great weakness is pride. It's really hard for people to switch gears once a gear has been put in place. Which brings me to my second reality course, which relates to poetry. The greatest poem in the English language that relates to civilization is one by W.B. Yeats at the end of World War I, called The Second Coming. And there's this famous line that the center cannot hold, while the best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And he was relating back to what seemed at the time to be the most terrifying war ever. And when we think of how that war got started and the fact that millions of people died, it's really hard to justify anything like it. And the question then becomes, though, are there aspects of this in our own society that we have to be careful of, and in world affairs, and what it all means. I'll just make a couple more comments about Congress that is a little different. If you take Congress, there is one philosophical matrix that no one thinks about in a legislative body but kind of understands, and that is there was a 19th century German philosopher named Hegel who talked about the notion of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And the assumption in a legislative chamber is that the Republicans say one thing, the Democrats another, and then you have a compromise. But one of the aspects of the last couple decades in American politics is that increasingly we're becoming a little bit Europeanized, that whatever is the minority party in Congress, in one of the legislative chambers, acts as if it's not a party of governance, and so it opposes what the majority proposes. And that has the effect of meaning that the only compromise is between the majority party. When I came into Congress, and I spent 16 years in the minority and 12 in the majority, I just assumed that everybody was elected to help govern. And that if a Democrat had a good idea, you'd go along, you might have an amendment to make it more fitting to your views or whatever. But then as time went on, there was this notion that if the other party proposed something and it looked pretty good, it would get credit for it of all the terrible things. And so there are very few issues in politics that you cannot be for or against it for the same reason. And by this I mean you can say, here's an idea in education, I'm against it because it's too much money, or I'm against it because it's not enough money. I mean, you can make either argument at any point in time, and then if you have a partisan lay to it, it can really skew the judgment processes. And right now that partisan lens is a pretty powerful one. And this brings me to something I relate to science. Everybody knows there was a great physicist named Isaac Newton who had these three laws of nature. One of which, or the third of which, was that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And this is an immutable law that no one has found a contrary proposition to until I did. And that is in social physics, unlike natural physics, sometimes reaction can be greater than action. And so if I called Dale a bum, as nice a man as he is, he might call me something worse. And you can get a kind of a competitive action-reaction cycle going. And this applies to human relations, it applies to partisan relations, and it can apply to relations between countries. Citizenship in all of this is quite difficult, and that's why it's important that we learn to think things through in ways that we might find take some hard work. But just as there are words that can divide, there are also words that can uplift. And the greatest in American history, I think, are the Declaration of Independence, that are truly uplifting, although it took a century and a half to give them full meaning, or more. And then you take Abraham Lincoln, I think in his second inaugural, when he addressed a country with the war coming to an end, and said we're going to have to, in effect, change directions with malice towards none and with charity for all. Those are really uplifting terms of art. I have a friend at the University of South Carolina who's a rhetorician. And on a MacArthur Fellowship, he studied the South African Revolution. And he's written a book, a thick book, and a series of essays that are fundamentally about one word. And it's a word that's kind of multisyllabic, and we all vaguely know what it means, but the word is reconciliation. And what he argues is that all of us, when we looked at South Africa, when Dale was in the Senate, I was in the House, the only certitude seemed to be that the system would have to change, and the likelihood was overwhelming that it would be the bloodiest revolution conceivable. But at a point with Nelson Mandela and the leadership of the white Afrikaners, a word started to be used about the need for reconciliation. And according to this South Carolina professor, when it was used, neither side meant it. And neither side knew exactly what it meant. And then they got trapped by it. And it started to have meaning, and they put it tentatively into play, and then the meaning itself, which one could have gone to a dictionary and found some sense to, came to have an evolving meaning based upon events and based upon decisions. And it ended up being one of the great uplifting words of the last couple of centuries. And we all know it somewhat worked. Now, some of you, coming back to sports, saw a movie called Invictus. I don't know if any of you did. I happen to have spent 8 years of my life, among other things, playing the sport of rugby. And 3 months ago, had a very interesting experience. And let me just say that the movie theme was that Nelson Mandela, as president of South Africa, identified with the white rugby team in an international tournament in South Africa. Well, I was at an event 3 months ago where the star of the game was present, and the South African ambassador who introduced the star. And he told a story. He said, now some of you have seen that movie, and you probably think it was a great exaggeration because it's a story that was told. And he said it wasn't an exaggeration at all. And what it was all about was that in South Africa, African blacks, to the degree they played sports, played American soccer. And only the white Afrikaners played rugby, and it was the greatest symbol of oppression in the land. And every black hated the rugby players. And whenever a foreign team would come, they would root for the foreign team. And then as president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela made this decision to identify with the team and suggest that because the World Championship was to be held in South Africa, it should be a national moment of reconciliation. And his strongest admirers came to him and said, "You cannot do this, Nelson Mandela." And the team, when they found that Mandela wanted to support him, was furious. And then Mandela came to talk to them. And then they went to this prison cell that he'd spent, I don't know, 22, 26 years in a prison cell that was about the size of that corner, cut in half again. And they became the greatest backers of Nelson Mandela. And it ended up that they won this game, and it was the greatest unifying event in South Africa. And by chance, they were not the favorites, they were the lesser team. And by chance, they tied at the end of the game, and they went into overtime. And this South African player kicks this winning, what we would call a drop kick from this terrible angle. Well, at this event I attended, two things happened. One, they showed the actual movie of the event, not the movie of the movie. And it was the greatest kick I have ever seen ever in rugby. It went like 8 stories high, split the uprights from an angle kind of like this, on the run with people charging this guy, and he kicks it side-footed. But the ambassador said something that was truly un-American, and I've never heard anything like this. He said, you know, as he's introducing the kicker, he said, and I forget his name, let's call him Joe. He said, you know, Joe is a Jew. What an odd thing to say. And he said, he's the only Jew in South Africa that plays rugby. Now, what American would ever say anything like that? But what he's saying was, it was kind of like someone that was different than the Afrikaners and different than the black South Africans that pulled the country together because he was a Jew. Well, how odd, but how kind of symbolic. And all I'm saying is sports can play an odd place at odd times. Anyway, just as my ending thoughts, there's no country in which the importance of the public square is more important today. And part of it relates to ourselves looking at ourselves. Part of it relates to the fact that we are the most watched country in the history of mankind. Everybody watches us. And foreign policy, oddly, begins at home. And it doesn't begin simply because decisions are made in the White House or the State Department. But everybody is watching us. And if we treat well this great immigrant society of ours, people that are immigrants, they reflect it back home. If we don't treat them well, that gets reflected back home. But also now with the communications techniques, everyone sees it. And when an American decides to burn a Koran, people react abroad. I mean, it's just weird. I mean, the best of us come out, the worst of us come out. And we have to pay such incredible attention, and with the obvious thought that if we don't try to respect and understand others, how in heaven's name are we going to expect them to try to respect and understand us? Thank you all.
We have time for a few questions. If you would raise your hand, we'll get the microphone to you.
If they're
Spencer?
too hard, I'm going to ask Dale to answer. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Spencer Lucker, and I'm a first-year student here. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I really appreciated your thoughts on the lack of civility and willingness to compromise in American culture, really, and political culture. I'm interested in your thoughts on how an increasing lack of civic education and civic awareness is really affecting this, growing divide between Democrats and Republicans and just the political culture in our country today. Thank you.
Well, I think it's an issue in America. I don't know if it's the absolutely the central issue, but it is a issue of significance that we don't have a proper civic education, because it's central to how we operate as a society. And it's my personal belief that if you take foreign policy, that I think the American public is going to have a much larger role in it than at any time it ever has in the past, and that's going to be an increasing phenomenon. That is, there was a time period in history that kings made decisions or their envoys made decisions, and today it's much more of a public involvement, and so I think that it's imperative that the public be educated in a civic way. And some of that isn't just how elections occur, how many members of Congress, how many people in the state legislature, or the difference between states and communities and the federal government, but it's what the issues are and what their meaning is. And so I think there is an awful lot of attention that is going on in America about problems with math and physics and science, et cetera, but people should be very careful not to overlook civic education. And civic education isn't just exactly how politics works. It's how people should think about each other. And we, for example, at the federal level, spend probably several hundred times as much on science and technology than we do on anything that relates to the social sciences, humanities, civic education, which are all kind of intertwined.
Questions? Fernando.
Thanks again for being here. I'm Fernando Coots, also a student at the Clinton School. You made that sports analogy, and I liked it a lot, how in sports we're actually more civil to one another because we have these referees and these high moral standards that we're taught our sportsmanship. What would you say could become, I guess, the referees in the political arena that would bring America back to the civility that we are lacking? Thank you.
Well, a lot of this is simple community ethics. Some is structural. I happen to be a radical on one subject, and that is money in politics. And I am really discouraged by a recent Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United, which has given an open door for corporations to give money. And by the way, corporations also implies unions. And it's rooted in actual logic that I find extremely frail. That is, the notion of the court is that a corporation is an individual and that money is speech. But if you go to the Constitution, there's no reference to those equations at all. If you go to the Federalist Papers, there's no reference. There's no comment of any founder that suggests that. But based on that reasoning, under the First Amendment, the court has ruled that you cannot curtail money in politics. And it was obviously, or not obviously, it was a 5-4 ruling. And the only way you can change that is either to have the court change it, meaning a new look, possibly new people, or a constitutional amendment. But I think people ought to be thinking about that. And I personally think anything that gets public policy back into an individual relationship nature with an elected representative, the better. Now there are other aspects. Some relate, when I talk about the problem with primaries, we need more participation in primaries. We need to leaven out circumstances. And There is another classical institutional issue, and it's the dullest issue in politics, which is redistricting. And I relate this, the analogy I make is to genealogy. Genealogy is wonderful within a family, and it gives a sense of history and background, etc. But no one cares about someone else's genealogy. Yeah, it just, one of those human nature things. And I'll tell you, if I say to you, we've got to have better redistricting, I mean, it'll take you between 2 and 3 seconds to shut your eyes. I mean, it's just not a subject that galvanizes, but it is an important one. And you can do things, I mean, like have nonpartisan commissions and greater involvement of courts and that sort of thing, and I would commend the Iowa model to other states.
I want to welcome a group here from Project Citizen. Clinton School professor Dr. Christy Standifer works for that project, and speaking of civic engagement, we're trying to do our part in making that happen. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to Chairman Jim Leach.